The desert sun beat down on the small forward operating base in New Mexico, a place that felt forgotten even by the Army itself. Dust clung to boots, uniforms, and skin, leaving a taste of grit in the mouth. Soldiers moved through their routines with the lazy rhythm of a garrison, not expecting much to happen. Trucks came and went. Radios crackled with background chatter. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled above, as if it knew this place held secrets of its own. And inside the mess hall, Private First Class Emily Reeves was stirring a massive pot of stew. The smell of onions and beef broth filled the air, and the clatter of trays and utensils echoed in the wide, tin-roofed hall. It should have felt ordinary, safe even, but to Emily the kitchen was a cage. Every day she put on the same apron over her fatigues. Every day she ladled out food with a polite smile, as though she hadn't spent years in training, as though she hadn't qualified on the range just like everyone else. She had signed up to serve, to protect, to be more than what people expected of her, but to the men at the base she was just the cook. "Hey, Reeves," one soldier called out, slapping his tray down in front of her. His name was Corporal Dixon, and he wore arrogance like a second skin. "You gonna season this with pepper, or with more of those tears you're hiding?" He grinned, elbowing the man beside him. Laughter rippled through the line. Emily's hand tightened on the ladle, but she kept her voice calm. "It's hot. Don't burn yourself," he winked. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Leave the real burning to us out there." He jerked his thumb toward the base perimeter. "You know, the actual soldiers." More laughter. She forced a smile, but inside her stomach twisted. She hated that word, sweetheart. It wasn't what she signed up for. She wasn't here to be the punchline of a joke. She was here because of her father. Sergeant Major Thomas Reeves had served 3 tours overseas before an IED ended his life. Emily was 17 when the uniform came home folded in a box. She remembered standing stiff at his funeral, promising herself she would wear the same uniform. Not in a kitchen, but on the line, where it mattered. But when she enlisted, things had turned out different. Her scores were solid but not exceptional. Her commanding officer had looked at her paperwork, at her quiet nature, at her gender, and steered her toward the support side. The Army needs cooks too, they had said. And Emily, desperate to prove herself in any way she could, hadn't argued. Still, every insult dug deeper than the last. That night, after serving chow, she sat alone in the back of the mess hall. The room was quiet, the last of the soldiers gone, the floor littered with crumbs and discarded napkins. She pulled off her cap and let her dark hair fall around her face. She hated the silence. It was in the silence that doubts crept in. Maybe they were right. Maybe she really was only meant to serve from the sidelines. But then she thought of her father. His voice still lived inside her, steady and strong. Strength doesn't always roar, Emily. Sometimes it whispers, and you follow it anyway. She whispered back into the empty hall, "I'm not just a cook." The next morning came with another round of jeers. "Reeves, when we go on patrol, maybe you can pack us sandwiches," one soldier said, strapping his rifle across his chest. "Better yet," another chimed in, "stay by the stove. If the enemy shows up, you can throw hot soup at them." The group erupted in laughter. Emily ignored them, but her jaw clenched. She had spent every spare hour training in secret. Early mornings, before anyone else woke up, she ran the perimeter with a weighted vest. Late at night, she slipped to the range and practiced until her grouping was tighter than half the infantrymen on base. She read manuals, studied maps, memorized tactics. She knew she was more than what they saw, but they didn't know, and maybe they never would. It was near noon when the atmosphere on base shifted. Emily felt it before she heard it. A tension in the air, like the world was holding its breath. She was carrying a tray of vegetables when the siren wailed. The sound pierced through walls and marrow. Soldiers scrambled, boots pounding on the dirt, voices shouting orders. "Incoming! Incoming!" someone yelled from the guard tower. Emily dropped the tray. Carrots rolled across the floor. She ran to the doorway, heart hammering. Through the dust and heat, she saw it. Vehicles kicking up clouds on the horizon, moving fast. The sun glinted off weapons mounted on the backs of trucks. The enemy was coming, and they weren't sneaking in. They were charging. The soldiers rushed to defensive positions, rifles in hand, shouting to one another. The ground seemed to shake under the rumble of approaching engines, and in that moment Emily knew 2 things. First, that this was no drill. It was real and it was about to get ugly. Second, that she wasn't going to stay in the kitchen. But as she stepped outside, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. It was Corporal Dixon. "Where the hell do you think you're going, Reeves?" he barked, half panicked, half smirking. "Your station's in there with the pots and pans. Stay put. Don't get yourself killed." Emily looked him straight in the eye. For the first time, her voice was steady, cold, and unshaken. "I'm not just a cook," he sneered. "We'll see about that." Then he shoved his helmet on and ran toward the wall with the others. Emily turned her gaze back to the horizon. The enemy was closer now. Dust clouds rising, engines roaring, shadows of armed men leaping from vehicles as they fanned out. The base was about to be tested, and so was she. Somewhere deep inside, under all the mockery and doubt, something fierce was waking. She would not stay behind. She would not be forgotten, because this was her moment and the enemy had no idea what was about to come. The alarm kept wailing, echoing across the base like the cry of something ancient. Soldiers scrambled to man their posts, boots hammering against the dirt, rifles clutched tight. The air itself felt charged, thick with dust and panic. Emily stood frozen in the mess hall doorway for a single heartbeat, her pulse pounding in her ears. She could see the trucks now, dark silhouettes rolling fast. Men clinging to the sides with rifles raised. Insurgents. Armed. Loud. Confident. The first shots cracked through the air. Bullets pinged against the perimeter walls. Shouts filled the compound. The base was under full assault. Dixon's voice rang out over the chaos. "Reeves, get inside!" But Emily didn't move. She was watching the dust, the movement, the way the enemy fanned out. She had spent months studying tactics in secret, and what she saw now froze her blood. They weren't charging head-on. Not really. The trucks at the front were a distraction. The real danger was on the sides. Two flanking groups had peeled away, circling wide like wolves. The defenders on the wall were blind to it. They were about to be surrounded. Emily turned back into the mess hall, her boots crunching over the carrots she had dropped earlier. The cooks and kitchen staff huddled in fear, wide-eyed. One young private clutched a broom like it could stop bullets. "We need to lock this place down," Emily said, her voice sharp. "Bar the doors. Move the tables against the windows, now." The staff hesitated. "We're not soldiers," one of them stammered. Emily's eyes blazed. "Neither am I, at least not to them. But we're not helpless. We have to hold this position or we're done." Her authority snapped them into motion. Together they shoved heavy tables against the glass, slammed metal shutters, and locked the doors. The mess hall was large and solid, built to last. It could be a fortress if they made it one. Emily ran to the supply closet and yanked it open. Rows of knives glinted under the dim light. Cleavers, butcher blades, carving knives. Tools of her trade, now weapons. She shoved them into trembling hands. "Take these. Stay quiet, stay low. If they breach, you fight for your life." One of the older cooks, a man with shaking hands, whispered, "What about you?" Emily's jaw tightened. She reached under the counter and pulled out the M4 rifle she had stashed weeks ago. Officially, she wasn't supposed to keep it there. But she had trained for this moment, even if no one believed her. Her fingers moved with practiced speed as she loaded a fresh magazine and checked the sights. The kitchen staff stared in shock. She wasn't just a cook. "Not even close. Me?" Emily said, chambering around. "I'm going to make sure they don't take us alive." Outside, the firefight was raging. Bullets ripped through sandbags. Smoke rose from the far side of the base where a truck had exploded. Soldiers yelled back and forth, disoriented. The commanding officer was barking orders, but his voice was drowned in the storm. Emily slipped out a side door, keeping low, her rifle steady. She sprinted to a stack of supply crates and crouched behind them, eyes scanning the horizon. And then she saw it again. The flanking groups. Dozens of enemy fighters were circling wide, moving fast through gullies and dry brush. They weren't aiming for the gates. They were aiming for the soft underbelly of the base. If they broke through there, the defenders would be crushed from all sides. Emily's stomach twisted. She knew she had seconds to act. She pulled the radio clip to her vest. Static crackled as she pressed the button. "Command, this is Reeves in the mess hall, enemy flanking south side. Repeat, they're circling. You're about to be surrounded." The reply was a mess of shouting and gunfire. Then a voice cut through. "Reeves, stay out of it. Hold your position in the mess. Leave the fighting to us." Her teeth clenched. Of course they didn't listen. They never did, but she couldn't just sit back. Emily sprinted along the mess hall wall, moving toward the southern edge. She dropped to her stomach and crawled up a small rise that overlooked the brush. Dust stung her eyes, but she could see them clearly now. Fighters moving low, rifles in hand, preparing to pour fire into the defenders' backs. She lined up her sight. Her breathing slowed, just like she had practiced in the dead of night when no one was watching. Inhale, exhale, squeeze. Her first shot cracked through the chaos. One insurgent dropped. The group froze, startled, scanning for where the fire had come from. Emily fired again. Another went down. They were exposed now. Gunfire erupted from the base wall as defenders finally noticed the flankers. The fight split into two fronts, shouts and screams tearing through the desert air. Emily kept firing, moving positions every few shots like she had read in the manuals. Her rounds cut through the brush, slowing the advance. But there were too many. One of the insurgents spotted her. Bullets tore into the dirt around her as she rolled behind a rock. Adrenaline surged hot in her veins. She was alone, outnumbered, and no one believed she belonged out here. But she wasn't backing down. She switched to burst fire, laying down suppressing shots to cover her retreat. She sprinted back toward the mess hall, lungs burning. Bullets whizzed past her ears, snapping into crates and sand. She dove through the side door just as rounds peppered the wall behind her. Inside, the kitchen staff gasped. "They're coming," Emily said, slamming the door shut. Sweat streaked her face. Her chest heaved, but her eyes were steady. "Get ready." The cooks and clerks, armed with knives and broomsticks, nodded in grim silence. They weren't soldiers, but under Emily's command, they felt like one unit. Outside, the sound of boots grew louder. The flankers were at the walls now, closing in. Emily crouched by the window slit, rifle ready. Through the narrow view, she saw them. Dozens of enemies spreading out, preparing to breach. She tightened her grip. This was it. They thought she was just a cook, but they were about to find out the truth. The base wasn't the one being surrounded anymore. They were. The mess hall was silent except for the pounding of boots outside. Shadows moved against the boarded windows, enemy voices barking in a language most of the staff didn't understand. But Emily didn't need to know the words. She could hear it in their tone, confidence. They thought this was going to be easy. Emily crouched low, rifle steady, eyes fixed on the door. Beside her, the cooks gripped their makeshift weapons with white-knuckled fear. A young private named Carter swallowed hard, holding a butcher knife that looked far too big for his shaking hands. "They'll break through," he whispered. "We don't stand a chance." Emily's voice was calm, sharp as steel. "We make them pay for every inch. Stay quiet, stay low." "Do exactly what I say." The staff nodded, eyes locked on her. For the first time since she'd arrived at the base, they weren't looking at her like a cook. They were looking at her like a leader. A slam rattled the door. Then another. The insurgents were testing it, ready to kick it in. Emily motioned with her hand. Two of the older cooks slid heavy soup pots full of boiling water across the counter, positioning them near the doorway. Improvised weapons ready to be poured the second the enemy breached. "Hold," Emily whispered. The door cracked inward with a thunderous crash. A boot shoved it wide and armed men poured into the hall. Emily fired. The first insurgent dropped before his boots fully crossed the threshold. The second stumbled back, screaming, clutching his shoulder. Boiling water splashed onto a third, and his cry cut through the air as he dropped his weapon and clawed at his skin. The kitchen erupted into chaos. Knives flashed. Rifle fire thundered. Emily moved with precision. Every shot deliberate, cutting down fighters as they tried to storm through the door. She barked orders between bursts. "Left window.
Cover it!
Move the tables, block the side entrance. Stay on the ground until I say move." The cooks obeyed without hesitation. Fear made them quick, but her voice made them steady. And in that storm of violence, Emily found a strange calm. Training, practice, and instinct took over. The world narrowed to targets, angles, and survival. For every enemy that fell inside, more regrouped outside. Gunfire hammered the walls. Splinters rained down. The mess hall shuddered under the assault. Carter let out a terrified shout as a fighter crashed through a side window, tackling him to the ground. Emily spun, rifle snapping up, but the angle was wrong. Without thinking, she hurled her empty sidearm. The heavy metal struck the insurgent's temple, stunning him just long enough for Carter to drive the butcher knife deep into his side. The man collapsed, and Carter looked up at her with wide, shocked eyes. "You're alive," Emily said firmly. Stay that way. He nodded, trembling, but determination lit his face now. The battle dragged on, minutes feeling like hours. Smoke hung in the air, thick and choking. The once bright mess hall was a ruin of overturned tables, shattered glass, and bodies. But somehow they were still holding. Emily crawled to the window slit again, peering out. She froze. Through the dust, she saw more enemy fighters moving. Not toward the mess hall this time, but toward the motor pool, circling behind the main barracks. They weren't giving up on the flank. They were doubling down. Her stomach sank. If they reached the motor pool, they'd have vehicles, heavy weapons, and the base would collapse from within. She yanked her radio, static hissing as she pressed the button. "Command, this is Reeves." Enemy pushing through south toward the motor pool. "If you don't move now, you'll lose the whole damn base." The reply was chaos, distant voices, no clear command. Nobody was listening. Fine, then she'd make them listen another way. Emily turned back to the staff. "We're not just holding anymore. We're going to hit them back." They stared at her like she was insane. "Hit them?" Carter stammered. "With what?" "We're cooks, not—" "You're survivors," Emily snapped. "And right now, survivors fight." She grabbed a crate from under the counter and pried it open. Inside were bottles of cooking oil and liquor. She shoved rags inside, then handed the makeshift Molotovs to the others. "When I say we light these and throw, we'll cut off their advance, force them back into the open. Then the soldiers on the wall will have the shot they need." One by one, they nodded. Their fear hadn't vanished, but it was burning into something harder now. Emily kicked open the side door. Gunfire roared as she darted out, dropping behind a stack of barrels. Her heart hammered, but her movements were sharp, steady. She struck a match, lit the first bottle, and hurled it toward the brush. Flames erupted, hungry and wild. The insurgents shouted in surprise as fire cut across their path. More bottles flew from behind her, igniting dry brush and forcing the fighters back into the open. The base walls erupted in gunfire as soldiers finally saw their chance, cutting down the exposed attackers. For the first time since the attack began, the tide shifted, but Emily wasn't done. She reloaded, sprinted to a half-collapsed barrier, and laid down cover fire to drive the survivors even farther into the kill zone. Every shot was vengeance, not for the insults, not for the mockery, but for her father, for the promise she'd made at his grave, and for the people cowering inside the mess hall. The insurgents faltered. Their flanking maneuver collapsed. The survivors retreated, leaving their dead scattered in the dust. Emily dropped behind cover, chest heaving, sweat dripping into her eyes. Her rifle was nearly empty. Her body ached, but when she glanced around, she realized something chilling. The enemy wasn't retreating entirely. They were regrouping, pulling back not in panic but in order. She followed their movement with her eyes. They weren't fleeing the base. They were shifting positions, digging in, and that's when it hit her. They hadn't just been trying to surround the base, they'd already done it. Her stomach knotted. The base defenders thought they had pushed the enemy back, but in reality the enemy had tightened their grip. Fighters were circling from all sides, closing off every road, every exit. The soldiers inside the walls didn't see it yet, but Emily did. She pulled her radio, voice sharp, urgent, unshaken. "They think they have us surrounded," she said into the static. "But they're wrong." Because Emily Reeves had a plan, and for the first time the enemy was about to realize they weren't hunting prey. They were walking into a trap. Smoke hung over the desert like a storm cloud. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning brush, stinging the lungs. The base had become a fortress of chaos. Shouts, gunfire, and the steady drum of boots against the dirt. Emily crouched low behind the wreckage of a supply truck, her rifle hot in her hands. Through the dust and smoke, she could see the enemy tightening their circle. They weren't breaking off. They weren't running. They were patient, confident. The base defenders thought they had pushed them back. But Emily saw the truth. The enemy had set a trap of their own. They had pulled in close enough to choke the base from every side. "They think they've got us," Emily muttered under her breath. Her chest rose and fell with steady determination. She clicked the radio on again. "This is Reeves, mess hall detail. Listen carefully, we're not surrounded." "They are." Her voice cut across static, low and sharp. A pause followed. Then came a reply, laced with disbelief. "Reeves? The cook? What are you talking about?" Emily's jaw tightened. She didn't have time for their doubt. They're in the open now, close enough for us to box them in. If we push from the inside while reinforcements strike from the ridge, they won't escape. But you have to move now, another pause. Then a weary, skeptical voice, Captain Harris. That's suicide. Stay put, Reeves. Emily's blood boiled. She wasn't asking for permission. She turned to the handful of cooks and clerks crouched behind the barricade with her. Their faces were pale, streaked with dust and sweat, but their eyes were locked on her with something new. Trust. They don't believe me, Emily said quietly, so we'll make them believe. Ready? One by one, they nodded. They were tired, terrified, but they weren't backing down. Not anymore. Emily gave a single, sharp command. Move. They burst from cover with fire in their eyes. Molotovs arced through the air, crashing into brush and barricades. Flames roared to life, cutting off enemy movement. Emily's rifle spat controlled bursts, driving fighters into the open. The cooks followed her lead, not with military precision, but with sheer determination. Knives, bottles, even a frying pan swung through the dust as they fought tooth and nail. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't polished. But it was effective. From the wall, soldiers gaped. The same men who had mocked her now watched as Emily Reeves led a ragtag defense with the ferocity of a seasoned warrior. And something shifted. Cover fire. Dixon's voice roared from the barricade. He was shouting at the infantry now, his voice cracking. Cover fire for Reeves! For the first time, the soldiers on the wall obeyed. Rifles thundered in unison, laying down a curtain of lead that pinned the enemy in place. Emily pressed her radio again, shouting over the chaos. Now call in the ridge. Above the desert ridgeline, the rumble of engines filled the air. Reinforcements had arrived, an armored convoy pushing fast, guns blazing. They swept down like thunder, cutting into the enemy's rear. The insurgents who thought they had the base surrounded suddenly realized the truth. They were the ones trapped. Gunfire turned frantic, wild. Shouts rose in panic. Some tried to flee, only to run headlong into the flames Emily had lit. Others were cut down between the base and the advancing convoy. Emily moved like fire itself, weaving through smoke and debris, directing her ragtag unit with short, sharp commands. She pulled Carter from the ground when he slipped, shoved another private toward cover, never once hesitating to step into the line of fire. Her rifle clicked empty. She dropped it, grabbed a fallen enemy's weapon, and kept fighting. Minutes felt like hours, and then suddenly it was over. The desert fell silent except for the crackle of flames. The last of the insurgents were down or captured, their weapons scattered in the dust. The survivors on the base stood stunned, their chests heaving, eyes wide. They had won, and they all knew why. Emily leaned against the battered mess hall wall, her body trembling with exhaustion. Sweat streaked her face. Her hands were black with soot and blood that wasn't hers. The cooks and clerks collapsed nearby, some laughing with disbelief, others weeping with relief. She pulled the radio once more, her voice ragged. Base secure. For a long moment, silence. Then the captain's voice crackled back, low, almost reverent. Copy that, Reeves. Well done. The words hit harder than the bullets had. Later, when the smoke cleared and the wounded were tended to, Emily walked across the compound. Soldiers lined her path, staring. Some nodded. Others straightened their shoulders, shame flickering in their eyes, and then, one by one, they began to salute. It wasn't ordered. It wasn't formal. It was raw, unspoken respect. At the end of the line stood Corporal Dixon, the same man who had mocked her every day she stood behind the stove. His face was bruised, his uniform torn, but his posture was rigid. He raised his hand to his brow, a salute sharp as steel. For the first time, his voice held no arrogance. Only respect, ma'am. Emily met his gaze, then returned the salute without a word. That evening, the mess hall smelled of food again. The kitchen was battered, glass shattered, tables overturned, but the stove still worked. Emily stood at the counter, stirring a pot of stew. Her uniform was stained, her hands bandaged, but her movements were steady. Soldiers filed in, silent, their eyes fixed on her. No laughter, no jeers. No jokes about soup or sandwiches. Only silence. Heavy, reverent silence. She served them with the same quiet strength as always. Ladle, bowl next. One young private, barely more than a boy, hesitated when he reached her. You saved us, he whispered. Emily met his gaze, her voice calm and simple. I just did my duty. She handed him the bowl and moved on. Later, when the night settled and the base grew quiet again, Emily sat alone on the steps outside the mess hall. The desert sky stretched endless above her, stars glittering like embers. She thought of her father. of the promise she had made at his grave. Strength doesn't always roar, Emily. Sometimes it whispers, and you follow it anyway. She had followed, through the jeers, through the doubt, through the fire, and now the base stood because she had refused to stay in the kitchen. They thought she was just a cook. But when the dust settled, everyone knew the truth. She was a soldier, through and through.